just thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Katie Gordon. She is a clinical psychologist, and she's author of a new book called The Suicidal Thoughts Workbook. It is a CBT skills to reduce emotional pain, increase hope, and prevent suicide. Um, Katie, I'd like you to introduce yourself because you know yourself better than I do, and tell me how all this came to be.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me on today about this important topic. When I was a grad student of Dr. Thomas Joyner's and actually worked with him as an undergraduate, and that's how I got really interested in suicide prevention. I was a professor for 10 years, and now I'm a therapist. And as a therapist, I see where there is a lot of need for mental health help. And currently, it's very hard for a lot of people to access that, whether it's financially or whether it's the number of therapists available. And so self-help spoke to me as a potential way to have a low cost, relatively speaking, workbook that people could connect with, get scientifically informed information, and hopefully get some help, even if they can't access a therapist at that time. So I didn't see a lot of self-help books for suicidal thoughts specifically, and suicide prevention is a big passion of mine, and so that's how I ended up developing the idea for this book.
Thank you. And when you brought up the word self-help, this is something that has come up in my discussions. And people seem to be initially sort of hesitant for self-help for suicidal ideation. Shouldn't these people that have thoughts be going to a therapist? Wouldn't that be better? Have you had that happen to you? Have people asked that? And then how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. The workbook is not a replacement for therapy. And in the workbook, I do talk about how it can be difficult without a therapist to work through those things. And so my belief in it is that working on the reality that not everyone can access a therapist, or some people might be reluctant to go. I don't want those individuals to be stuck without anything. What I do throughout the workbook is encourage people to connect with others as they're working through it, whether it's clergy or family or friends, so that they're not having to go through it alone. But it's certainly very compatible with therapy. And I do wish it were the case that everyone without stigma, without any barriers, could access the treatment that they want. We're not there currently, and so this is a way to provide the information to people in a way that provides greater access in the reality that not everyone has access to a therapist right now.
Thank you. I think that's an important point between the people that might be reluctant to seek care, or that they don't have the financial resources, or there aren't the resources of therapists in their area. So there's a very long wait list. To have something more readily available that's affordable, I think provides resources to a broader population. So how did you lay out the book? Can you explain a little bit about what it is?
Absolutely. And so the way that it's organized is around a leading theory of suicide called the three-step theory, which is it was originally published by Klonsky and May in 2015. And the theory talks about these different factors that contribute to suicidal thoughts and suicidal behavior. And the three steps, the first step is that people who are in pain and who feel hopeless about that pain ever changing desire suicide because their life is so painful, and they feel that if they feel that there's no way to get better, then they'll desire suicide. The second step talks about how those individuals who are in pain but who have connections to life, whether it's through relationships or meaningful projects or meaningful roles, whatever it might be, if they have those connections to life, then the suicidal desire will not intensify. It'll kind of stay at a certain level. However, if the pain is greater than those connections to life, or those connections to life are missing or lower, the person's very isolated or feeling pointless in their life, that then their suicidal desire will intensify. And the third step, drawing on the interpersonal theory of suicide from Joyner and colleagues talks about those individuals who are in a lot of pain, have lower connections to life where the pain exceeds it, and who are capable of dying by suicide are the ones who will attempt suicide. And what that means is that they have a lower fear of death, or that they have a high pain tolerance. And one of the reasons this is of concern with physicians and people in medical care and healthcare fields is just part of the profession means having some habituation, getting used to being around pain, being around seeing people go through, seeing people die. And so those kinds of things can make it such that if someone desires suicide, they have a higher capability for suicide. And that combination can put someone at very high risk.
Yes, and I love the three-step model. I also love the Joyner theory of suicide with the three overlapping circles. Um, they're quite congruent in looking at suicidal ideation. Um, and I agree with you. Physicians have the capacity. I will say physicians always will have one strike against them because that capacity is the knowledge of death. It is the access. We have prescription power, and that talks about one of the means. And then there's that exposure to death and having the overcoming the fear of that. Most of us have experiences during medical school, residency, that to get through things, you have that exposure. And then, particularly for our trainees, um, sleep deprivation. People who are not sleep have enough sleep are going to be more impulsive in making their decisions. So I think we should just give physicians the capacity right then. So those other two, either the other two questions or the other two areas of Joyner's model, the thwarted belongingness and the perceived burdensomeness, how do you address that in your book?
It's so important, and I think especially during this pandemic where so many people in healthcare and physicians have had extra stress and had extra things connecting to that. So there is in my workbook a chapter that really focuses on building and maintaining connections. I think especially when people are overworked, stressed out, or even feeling down, some of our tendencies are to isolate or withdraw. And so, really, what the chapter in the book for relationships and connections focuses on is saying that maintaining those relationships and interpersonal connections is as important for your health as not smoking, as eating nutritious foods, as getting some physical activity. We need other people to have good mental health. And so what it does is it breaks it down into small steps. They don't have to be huge things. They can be small connections where you're reaching out, you're talking to someone, you're connecting people within your household or your neighbor or whatever it might is, but you're prioritizing it so it's something that you regularly do. When people are struggling with suicidal thoughts, I think that some of the barriers include feeling like other people don't want to be around you. And so a big theme of the book is pushing back against it. Well, while you're in pain, you can feel like other people don't want to be around you, but let's look at some of the evidence and let's try to overcome those obstacles to form those connections. And the perceived burdensomeness is treated somewhat of the same way, where there are exercises and worksheets pushing back against that idea that the person is a burden to others and identifying the ways that they contribute, make the world a better place. And again, this part of the recommendations are pulling in other people, so this doesn't have to all come from the person who's struggling, whether they're in therapy or whether they later decide to go to therapy, or if it's people in their personal lives who can help them see how they actually do belong and how they are not a burden on others.
I love that. And when I look at the Joiner's theory for thwarted belongingness, that's the connection. The perceived burdensomeness, I think one of the strongest areas and one of the chapters in the book is creating meaning. And that creating meaning for, I think, for physicians, having that meaning of your work. And right now, with the pandemic, I know a lot of people are struggling with that, but prioritizing that meaning that what we do is important, I think, makes a difference. There's another chapter that I think physicians struggle with. And I'm going to flip it from what it's actually called. I think physicians have a very high amount of self judgment. I think that self judgment is how we've gotten the success we have, how you've gotten good grades in college and medical school, gotten into residency, and self judgment has really worked for us. But then when you get into your job, that self judgment doesn't work as well. Um, and we have trouble flipping that. You have a chapter on self compassion. How have you found that people accepting that and working through self compassion?
I appreciate you making that point because one thing I forgot to mention in my introduction is I am a therapist in a medical setting. And so I do come across individuals struggling with exactly what you said, kind of high success, perfectionism, and drive, and kind of pushing yourself along, kind of like a cattle prod. But that can also turn against you because then it's never good enough, right? And then people tend to focus on the discrepancy of what they imagined they could do versus what they're doing. And so, something that I found with self compassion, of all the things that we can control in the world, there's so much we can't control, but I do see gains in people being able to relate to themselves more kindly. And I do think it's a step by step process because, just like you said, it involves validating that self judgment and self criticism played a role and was adaptive in certain ways. But how can we be flexible and try a different approach when it's not helpful? I think people are afraid when they're self compassionate, they're going to lose their drive, their motivation, or something like that. And it's scary. So if we test it. We say, okay, let's just try this week. Try it a couple times, do the self compassion approach. And what people tend to find actually is that they're enjoying their work more, they're feeling less burned out, they're feeling more patience with their family and with other people in their lives. And so I do think that self compassion aspect can really be, it can be life changing. And I talk about how it's a skill to practice. It's not something that's automatic for most people, but it's something that you can try on because otherwise, when you're struggling with suicidal thoughts, keeping on top of that judgment, like I shouldn't be thinking this and there's something wrong with me and I'm not good enough, can just build and build and build. So the idea is to cut that off and try to reverse it.
Yes, I think having that practice is really good. Um, and I've noticed through your book, you reference lots of experts, like the three-step theory with Dr. Klunsky, self-compassion. Dr. Kristen Neff is one of the names out there, and in your book, we haven't talked about this before, but have you seen her quiz on self-compassion?
I have not seen her quiz, which is kind of surprising because I visit her website often.
There is a quiz, and when we're talking about this judgment and compassion thing, it's funny. The first time I took it, I was terrible. And so there's that immediate judgment. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm terrible at self compassion. I really have to work on this because I'm terrible. And it's like, yes, I took a quiz on self compassion and I had all kinds of judgment about it. I find her site very useful in that area.
You're so right because it's kind of you don't want to turn it into another way to criticize yourself. You know, it's hard to learn self compassion, but you're so right. At first, you can be like, "Wow, I do this all the time. I criticize myself all the time. It's another thing that's wrong." Yeah.
But it wasn't drive to get better. It's that whole problem with self judgment. We've learned to use that to get to the heights that we are, and so it is a practice. I appreciate you saying that. Another name that came up was Dr. Tom Ellis, and where I know uh, that from in suicidal ideation is hope and how hope plays in suicidal thoughts. Did you want to comment on that at all? Because I know that's another chapter.
Absolutely. I hope is is so crucial because we can withstand a lot of pain if we think that there's some chance of it, and hope and finding strategies for that is hard when you're in a lot of pain, because a kind of tunnel vision can take over, and that pain is real, and it's hard at those times to say, let me find the bright spots. I certainly find that to be true. And so the hope chapter really tries to break down, here are some ways to create small sparks of hope. The idea is to make it seem attainable. We're just looking for some bright spots, because I think it can actually be overwhelming to feel in a place of pain and feel suicidal and feel like you have to kind of look on the bright side. It's not about that. It's about realistically looking, are there some things I look forward to in the future? Are there some reasons to believe I can get through this based on past experiences that I've had? And also, what can I do to take care of my emotions right now in this moment that will help me to feel more hopeful? And something that I find interesting is that even little uplifts during the day can be those sparks of hope, that no matter how down you feel, someone hears from someone they hadn't heard from for a while, or they see a piece of art or a movie that moves them, and those things can just shift the perspective enough to believe, okay, there might be a way through this pain.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree that hope and having those individual moments, recognizing that is really important. And so I appreciate the tools that you put in there. In part of that recognition, I think, is that mindfulness, that you're just in the moment rather than in your head, is a important part. And having that three good things or gratitude, when you practice that, I think it does help. Is that one of the things that you recommend?
Absolutely. So I think that it's hard because it's kind of like when we're suffering, our mind is drawn towards other things that confirm that things are bad, right? And so part of the idea of the book and what a lot of therapies try to do is exactly what you're saying, is like, what are the things that I feel grateful for? What are the things that can bring me joy alongside the pain? It doesn't necessarily mean the pain goes away, but it might lessen. It might mean that, because even though at this moment I'm struggling with anxiety, depression, whatever it is, I can still have meaning, I can still have better moments. And I think that can be enough for people to hang on and keep moving along and working towards the life that they want to live, and how they want to feel.
Yes. Um, One of the things that I really like about the book is that I have approached this with residents from the other aspect. You have the tools broken down, and then at the end, have the chapter on creating safety. I have talked to people that all physicians should have a resilience plan, personal crisis management plan, safety plan, whatever words you want to use. How have you found that for patients or even healthcare workers that you work with?
I think safety planning is huge. I think that most people, um, once the rationale is explained, I think that most people get on board with that and find it helpful, because the whole goal of it is that even if you're not in crisis right now, if we have a plan for what to do when you're in crisis, it's going to make things easier, because it's very hard to do helpful things when you're in this state. So planning ahead, it can kind of build on those strengths that a lot of physicians and others have, which is planning ahead. Say, well, let's plan ahead. What are you going to do when this happens? Here are the people that you'll contact. Here are the coping skills you'll try. Here are the things you'll remember about your reasons for living. And so I think that those things, including the importance of means, making sure that if there's a gun in the home, that it's stored, in a safe, that the ammunition is separate, that if there are medications for potential overdose, that they are kept away somewhere, maybe locked away during a crisis. That those kinds of practical steps and explaining the purpose of them, I think that people have responded really well to, because then they have it with them. They can have a picture in their phone, or they can have a physical piece of paper. And there's some sense of safety, even just having something to do in those moments that can be helpful and potentially life-saving.
Absolutely. And I think that contact is really important. Have you found people wondering if they should tell the other person that they're on their contact list and how to do that?
Yes, I think that it can be so hard, and I do encourage people to share it. What I found sometimes is when people make that, they actually use it as a way to share their struggles with that person in the context of saying, I'm meeting with a therapist. We came up with this safety plan because I'm struggling, and you're on it because I know when I call you, you're going to listen to me, or you're going to support me, or you'll spend time with me. And I think even though it's hard and it can be difficult, it opens up a dialogue about the potential benefits of sharing and connecting with that person. And it also opens a conversation of emotional safety. Let's identify people who are likely to respond well. And then whoever that person is, whether they're a friend or whatever happens, often I'll hear the feedback is they were happy to hear how they can help me, because sometimes they see me struggling and they don't know what to do. Here I could say, well, what really helps me is spending time with me, giving me a hug, or whatever it might be. And now they feel less anxious in that crisis moment because they also understand what would be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Having that plan open the conversation might be the way to bridge that. Well, I thank you so much for your time. I wanted to give you the chance here. Is there any other things that you would like to add that I didn't ask about?
I just want to say how very much I appreciate everyone working in healthcare during the pandemic. Your work is incredibly meaningful, and the long ongoing stressors are so difficult. You are worth help and worth self-compassion, and I just thank you so much for all that you're doing. And thank you for listening to this interview.
Well, thank you so much. I will put your book, try to get this in here. I think that this is a great resource. It's something that's available at 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe after you get off a bad shift. I work in emergency medicine, and that middle of the night time, it's hard to find somebody available. And for you to have created this resource, I think is really great. So thank you for your time here on our fourth National Physician Suicide Awareness Day and taking care of our healthcare workers. Thank you.